Charles, going into the legislative session, we had this giant budget gap. I think originally a couple of years ago, we were told that we had a transportation gap of about 500 million. And then by the time this year's legislative session came around, if memory serves, it was like $1.3 billion. Do you believe that that's an accurate representation of the kind of gap that we have between the funding that's needed to fix our problems and what they actually bring in transportation dollars? That's question number one.
Well, there is a transportation funding gap. How big it is depends upon what you think the needs are and what revenues you're willing to make available for it. So in the case of the state highway system, the gas tax hasn't been increasing very much. Total state tax revenues have doubled in the last dozen years. So the state's got, very strong revenue growth, but the transportation budget hasn't been growing nearly as much. One of the complications is that for the state, they've been underinvesting in basic highway preservation and maintenance for a long time, at least 10 years. So now they have this big $1 billion per year backlog as a result of work they didn't do before.
So it's like the maintenance backlog. It's like if you didn't get the oil change in your car and all of a sudden you got parts falling off, now you've got a bigger problem to fix.
Yeah, what happens with repaving in particular is if you don't keep up with it, and most highways and streets need to be repaved anywhere from every 10 years to every 15 years, depending upon how much traffic, how many trucks, that kind of thing. But if you let it go too long, the pavement deteriorates to the point where you need to totally rebuild the roadway, strip off the old pavement.
So now it's, instead of repaving the top, you've got to dig, it's like a root canal. You got to dig out all that material underneath and start over.
That's right. It's a complete reconstruction, and that costs anywhere from 3 to 7 times as much. And because we have a lot of old pavement on our state highways, there's going to be a lot of very expensive reconstruction. And the same applies to the bridges. The state has several thousand bridges spread around the state, and a lot of them are 60, 70, even 100 years old. So those are going to be expensive to fix.
When we talk about the deferred maintenance problem, as you said, for the previous decade and a half or so, maybe even longer, where was the money going instead of, there was a collection of money that should have been going toward these things. Where was it going instead?
Well, it's funny you ask, because if you hear some of the conversation in the legislature, they make it sound like, oh, we spent too much on the new highway projects, like replacing the 520 bridge and widening I-405 and the gateway projects on 167 and 509. Those are big ticket projects, $1 billion easily, each one of them. But that isn't the only place the money went, because over the last 10 years, the state has significantly expanded non-highway programs. And so large amounts of money, hundreds of millions of dollars a year, have been going to bicycle and pedestrian facilities, transit subsidies, green programs, and things like that. So that's where some of the revenue that the state collects for transportation has been going instead of fixing our highways.
Didn't some of those larger ticket items have specific funding mechanisms too that were separate from the transportation budget, if I remember correctly?
Well, they're part of the transportation budget, but it is separate. And so, for instance, on the SR 520 bridge replacement, they got a bunch of federal money, which is great. And they also collect tolls on the bridge, and those tolls are dedicated to paying off the project. The state has issued by now many billions of dollars in bonds to pay off major highway projects. And, that's a great way to finance them up front. The downside is you got to pay them off with interest over time.
Anybody going to Gig Harbor also knows. So there's
yes.
like, yes, we've been paying tolls. Yeah.
Yeah. And as the state has expanded their tolling program, they've also expanded their issuance of debt. And now they have to pay that off. And those interest payments represents money that isn't available for things like fixing highways.
So at a certain point, we've had a decade and a half of neglect. I don't think there's any debate about that, really. Former Governor Inslee might complain, but Right now, it's just a fact to deal with. So, we can all point backwards and say there was all kinds of mismanagement problems, and there were, and I think it's important to learn from that. But that doesn't, but the mess we're in is the mess we're in. And now it's a question of what do we do about it? Is the mess that we're in, does that mean that we must expect higher taxes, fees, and tolls in order to fix the mess we're in? Or, I mean, we could sit here and make the mess worse, I guess, by kicking the can down the road. I think you just wrote a blog saying the cost of kicking the can down the road, but assuming that we want to get better, what does that take in a transportation world?
Yeah, the kicking the can down the road approach has been taken, and now the legislature.
We're really good at that.
Yeah, we've done a lot of that. And the legislature has slowly come to the conclusion that that is probably not a good way to do it going forward. So they have some options, and higher taxes and fees are definitely part of the conversation, but that isn't the only potential course of action. As I'm sure you're very well aware, the state already has some of the highest gas prices in the country. That's partly because we have a high gas tax and partly because we have a carbon emissions fee, which the legislature decided rather arbitrarily would not be used for highway purposes.
Just a quick side note, Todd Myers, our environmental director and also vice president for research, calculated that the most current auction for carbon pricing for the CCA tax is 40 cents per gallon. So when you're paying gas, an extra 40 cents per gallon is going to that, not the highway fund, but going to the Climate Commitment Act fund right now.
Yeah, so it's kind of strange that the burden of the tax falls mostly on motorists and consumers, but the money isn't going into fixing our highways. What the legislature could do is loosen the purse strings a little bit on that carbon emissions revenue, which is what, about $1 billion a year or something like that, and allow that to be used to fix the highways. Another possibility that's been discussed is to shift some of the sales tax that's collected on the sale of automobiles into the transportation fund, because right now sales tax all goes into the general fund and the legislature uses it for all kinds of things, much of which has no benefit to the people paying the tax when they're driving their cars.
What kind of money are we talking about there? Because when I hear sales tax on automobiles, I think, well, how much can that be? How many cars are we selling a year? What does that look like?
It's actually a significant amount. It could easily be several $100 million a year, because automobiles are big ticket items and they sell I don't know, probably at least 500,000 of them a year in the state of Washington. So there's a significant amount of revenue that could be generated for transportation without actually raising taxes, but just by shifting it from the general fund to the transportation fund. Politically, that has not gotten a lot of support in the legislature. A bill to shift the sales tax from cars on cars to the transportation fund has been introduced in several previous sessions of the legislature
since at least 2017 that I can think
of. And it hasn't gotten anywhere. But as the situation has gotten worse, the legislature is starting to get more desperate, and they may actually be willing to consider sensible proposals of that type.
What kind of taxes are on the table right now, or are you hearing what kind of? I mean, with the transportation budget, things are a bit of a mystery in the legislature. It's been my experience until the end.
They are, and most of those conversations are taking place behind closed doors.
Right.
Occasionally you hear things through the keyhole, and some of the ideas I think are more practical than others. One thing the legislature was looking at was a retail delivery fee. So you'd pay a little surcharge for any thing, delivery of food or household items. Think of it as a tax on Amazon and Federal Express. But it turns out those are kind of tricky to do, and they're not terribly popular. So I don't think that's going anyplace this session. Other possibilities that have been suggested are a tax on tires, or increasing the tax on tires. There's already, I think, a disposal fee of $2 a tire or something that you get charged. And increasing weight fees. As you know, electric vehicles weigh more in most cases than cars with gas engines. And so there's thought that maybe there should be a higher fee on electric vehicle, well, on heavy vehicles, which would include electric vehicles.
Well, I know tires aren't cheap. The last time I bought a tire, I'm pretty sure there's a lot of tax on it. And the overall price of the tire has become an issue for families there. So the more they increase the price of the tire, the longer people are going to want to stretch the life of a tire.
Yep.
And then you have your own, Washington State already has a pretty dramatic increase in accidents and road fatalities as it stands. So, there's some trade-offs there that might want to be considered.
And speaking of trade-offs, one other idea is a road user charge, which is like a vehicle miles traveled tax.
Mm-hmm.
And a bill was introduced in the legislature earlier this session that got quite a bit of attention, that would phase in this road user charge first on electric vehicles because they don't pay the gas tax, and then later on other vehicles. There was a lot of public opposition to that. About 20,000 people registered their position on the legislature's website, and about 97% of those were opposed to the idea.
I was about to say there's the 20,000 people, and then there's the handful of government agencies testifying.
Yeah.
Those are the ones that were in favor. Yeah. Everybody else generally opposed.
Yeah, most of the government entities that stand to get a cut of that thought it was a wonderful idea. That bill didn't make it out of committee, but because it may be necessary to implement the budget, it could come back to life. What I think may actually ultimately cause it not to advance in this session, even though there are some legislators who are strongly in favor of it, is that the way it's proposed to be phased in, it mostly replaces the electric vehicle fee and the gas tax on existing high mile per gallon vehicles. So it doesn't solve the legislature's budget problem because it doesn't generate a lot of new revenue. It replaces existing revenue sources. And that dampens the enthusiasm of legislators who are looking for more revenue.
Yeah, excited about that new revenue. Now, they've had years of ballooning revenue, like you say, on the general fund, which has lots of portions of it have connections to motorists.
Yes.
And yet the transportation needs of the state have been ignored, that not only for commuters, but for freight, for every single purpose you can think of. It's astonishing to me because it's like the economic arterial system, artery system, circular system of the state. And this conversation, I feel like we could have had it, 5 years ago, 8 years ago. We've had these. I remember a gubernatorial race almost 20 years ago where there was talk of, what are you going to do about these bridges? And so these problems have been. There has been a serious failure of leadership in Washington State and transportation for many, 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 many years. What about ways to improve the system without raising taxes? We brought up the ferry system. There's this desire to change the fleet to the electric ferry. We all know that's more expensive. We all know we already have sunk costs of how many millions of dollars based on the fact that we originally were going to get diesel engines, and then we had plans for that, plans that were drawn out. They spent tens of millions of dollars or more on that. And then they switched gears to electric, which are not as feasible and are much more expensive. What if we just went back to saying, we're going to have diesel and we can buy carbon credits on the open market? How much would we save in terms of projected expenditure just doing that?
The ferry system has not estimated that amount because they haven't had any appetite, at least not publicly, for buying more diesel ferries.
Of course.
When the last governor was in office for 12 years, he was very strongly in favor of electrifying the ferry system. And so there really wasn't any consideration of buying clean diesel ferries instead. So we don't have a recent estimate, but by all indications, the diesel ferries would be much more economical. And just yesterday at the Senate Transportation Committee meeting, the ferry system indicated that they intended to buy 11 new hybrid electric ferries. And those are very likely going to cost about $350 million each, maybe more. So you do the math, that's, close to $4 billion.
It's astonishing to me because you look at a state where, that they say that there's this gap. We all, I know we differ with that because there's been this ballooning of government. There's been plans to take one-time money and spend it. And so there's a self-inflicted gap, but let's just take it as it is. If you say you don't have enough money to get everything that you want, like I would really like a brand new, four-wheel drive SUV that I could take in the mountains. That would be awesome. However, I know I can't afford that. So I would, as a rational human being, I would instead get something, say 10 years old with low miles if I could get it. And that's what I would get for my family car. The legislature instead is, hey, we really, really want these cool electric hybrid ferries that cost, 40% more or 30% more than these other ferries that would do the job. And we don't want to give that up. And then that same thing applies down the road on all these different categories. At what point, what's the lever that gets people to think of doing things in a different way that it costs less so that these things can get done?
The lever, or maybe it's getting hit over the head, is starting to happen. And the difficult conversation that is beginning in the legislature is between finding new sources of revenue, shifting existing sources of revenue to transportation to help fill the gap, or deferring projects or cutting them altogether. And this is difficult because when you've got a project like the SR 167 connection to I-5, and it's already half built, it doesn't make sense to stop now because you would want to complete it eventually anyway, and it will end up just costing you a lot more. And
There's not going to be any there'll be economic benefit from its completion, but not if it sits there.
That's right. And so there's no obvious solution there. They continue to look at it. Other possibilities are cutting back on some of the non-highway programs, the bike lanes, the transit subsidies and things like that. But there's a strong constituency that supports those in the legislature, and that makes that difficult too. In the case of the ferry system, they are scheduled to get bids on the new hybrid electric ferries next month. And I don't know if that will be in time to be taken into consideration in the transportation budget, but that may force difficult decisions.
How does that make sense either? Like, if you're going to get these bids in for a major ferry project, why wouldn't there be a requirement for those bids to come in while the legislature is actually debating what their budget is, right?
Well,
to see what is this even feasible? Because if they wait till afterward, then they can say, well, it's all overages. We got a big hole next year,
The electrification plan began in 2018 with the governor's executive order. And under the original timeline, those boats would already be in service. So there have been years of delays. And even the revised schedule called for bids last October. And then it got postponed until early 2025. And then it got pushed out again to April. So it would have made the legislature's job easier if they had had that information a couple months ago. And so now, I mean, I've even heard the possibility that they may call a special session if the bids come in high and the program is unaffordable. So
this is one of those things where even people in Eastern Washington might be thinking ferry system, that's a Seattle problem. There's a pot of funds, and the more that's spent on foolish things here means other projects, other bridges aren't fixed, other roads aren't fixed. The money is not devoted to the North-South Freeway. All these kinds of things matter because it's, that we're one Washington state, and that's where these interconnections end up being real key. Did we have a question?
What is the impact of fish passage federal injunction on the transportation budget? That's one excuse I hear from my reps why there's not enough money for the WSTOT.
The question, we got to repeat it, is what is the impact of the federal injunction on fish passage and on the transportation money? That's the reason why they hear from their rep why there's not enough money to accomplish certain projects.
that's a very good question. And because the state got sued and they lost in federal court, so they were ordered to repair or replace hundreds, actually probably more than 1,000 culverts under state highways all across the state where it interfered with migrating salmon and other fish. This is a big, expensive project. The state has spent about $4 billion on that so far, which came out of the transportation budget.
Of course.
And then they said, well, we need to finish this up by 2030, I think it is. And it's going to cost us another $4 billion, unless it turns out to be $5 billion or more. And so this is a huge drag on the state transportation budget. The legislature does not have to pay for that out of the transportation budget. They could take it out of other places. But in the past, it's come out of the transportation budget. So the only good news there is that just within the last couple of weeks, it was announced that mediation has been agreed to between the state and the tribes and other parties, so that they're going to explore other ways they might be able to resolve this culvert problem without spending very large amounts on replacing culverts that don't actually improve fish habitat, because you have situations where the state repairs their culvert and 200 yards upstream, the county or the city or a railroad has built a bridge or some impediment that blocks fish passage. So if you're going to do it, the logic is, let's do it in a coordinated fashion that repairs or improves the most habitat, instead of just throwing money in order to meet this court order that isn't necessarily solving the problem.
Excellent. Any other questions?
You kind of already covered this one, but someone asks, did Ferguson approve construction of 2 new diesel or electric ferries?
Did the new Governor Ferguson, approve the construction of 2 new diesel or electric ferries?
Well, not new ones, but what the governor did a week or two ago was he announced that the plan to convert 3 of the existing jumbo ferries that are diesel powered to hybrid electric. They've been working on the first one. It was supposed to take a year. It's taken close to 2 years. It's way over budget, and they don't have any spare ferries. So the governor decided that they would postpone conversion of the other 2 until sometime after 2026. And that way they'll have more ferries that they can have in service this summer and next summer too.
That's one case where I'm in favor of kicking that can down the road. Let's not convert those right away.
Yeah. Now the question of the new hybrid electric ferries, he's indicated that that question will be addressed probably in June, after we have the bids and after they figure out where to go next with that.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Charles. That about
Thank you.
wraps us up for time, and thank you for coming, and thank you for watching. Be sure to share this video on YouTube with us, and don't forget, this week we'll be releasing our report card for Washington's Future Transportation chapter. So you'll see some really key information, some of what you've heard today, but a lot more that you haven't, about key aspects of our transportation system, where we're at in Washington State, how we got there, and where we should be going. So be on the lookout for that coming up later this week at washingtonpolicy.org. My name is David Bowes, Communications Director. We'll see you next Tuesday.